The truth about the Anunnaki and ancient gods. In ancient Sumer Babylon, like many other cultures of its time, mythologies were created to explain the world around them. One such mythology is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Although several versions of the epic poem exist, the 12-tablet Akkadian version is the most well-known. The Epic of Gilgamesh features a significant flood story in which a character named Utnapishtim and his wife survive a massive flood and gain eternal life. The presence of this story, which shares numerous similarities with the account in Genesis, suggests a shared source. This indicates that both accounts are independent records of an actual event, a global flood. It is essential to note that the Genesis flood narrative was not copied from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but rather, both accounts present distinct versions of the same event. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods who make an appearance are known as the Anunnaki. This name is believed to mean those of royal blood or princely offspring in the ancient Sumerian language. In contrast to this pagan mythology is the biblical account of the Nephilim. The Nephilim were the descendants of the sons of God and daughters of men, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4. While there are various interpretations of this passage, it is generally believed that it involves fallen angels, sons of God taking human form, and mating with human females, daughters of men, resulting in the creation of a race of angelic human half-breeds. Is there a link between the Anunnaki and the Nephilim? It's intriguing to note that the biblical flood story and the Epic of Gilgamesh both mention godlike beings interacting with humanity in relation to a global flood. This suggests that the Anunnaki myths could be rooted in the actual existence of the Nephilim. The Bible gives us hints at a world that had deviated far from what God intended. The Anunnaki are a group of gods from ancient times, worshipped by the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In the oldest writings of the Sumerians, dating back to after the Akkadian period, the Anunnaki were gods in the pantheon. They came from An and Kai, the god of the heavens and the goddess of the earth. Their main job was to decide the destinies of people. It is important not to mix them up with the Apkallu. The name Anunnaki comes from An, who was the Sumerian god of the sky. The Anunnaki are mostly found in old stories, and there is not much physical proof that people actually worshipped them. This might be because each Anunnaki god or goddess had their own separate worship, not as a group. Likewise, no images showing all the Anunnaki together have been found. The gods in ancient Mesopotamia were usually shown in human form. People believed that these gods had amazing powers and were often pictured as being very large. Usually, gods were shown wearing hats with horns. These hats could have up to 7 sets of bull horns stacked on top of each other. Sometimes, they were also shown in clothes with fancy gold and silver designs stitched in. There were specific priests whose job was to look after these statues. Also, ancient writings from Sumer don't always describe the Anunnaki gods the same way. They don't agree on how many Anunnaki there were or what their jobs as gods were. At first, the Anunnaki were thought to be powerful gods from heaven. In the story, Enki and the World Order, the Anunnaki respect Enki, sing songs to honor him, and live among the people of Sumer. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. Babylonians and Assyrians envisioned Marduk as a prominent member of the Anunnaki, their national god. Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, ruled over domains associated with fertility and vegetation. However, comprehending Mesopotamian deities can be perplexing due to Marduk's identity, which consists of a staggering 50 names, including the title Baal. It is noteworthy that Marduk's influence extended beyond Babylon, finding reverence among the Assyrians and Persians as well. The various titles and representations of Marduk underscore the rich tapestry of ancient Babylonian religious beliefs and the challenges in disentangling the intricacies of their pantheon. Marduk was a deity that was worshipped as the main god in Babylonian religion. He had many titles, including Baal, which means Lord. He was regarded as the god of storms and fertility, similar to the Canaanite god Baal. The name Marduk is mentioned explicitly only once in Scripture, in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 2. Declare among the nations, lift up a signal to spread the news, publish and proclaim it, do not conceal it. Say, Babylon has been taken, Baal, the patron god, has been shamed, Marduk, Baal has been shattered. Babylon's images have been shamed, her worthless idols have been thrown down. In this passage, Jeremiah predicts that when God brought judgment upon Babylon, the false god would be exposed and humiliated. The destruction of Babylon would demonstrate that the nation's deities were false and useless gods. The title of Marduk, which is Baal, is mentioned in both Isaiah chapter 46 verse 1 and Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 44. The Babylonian religion worshipped many gods instead of just one. It is evident that the Enuma Elish creation story is vastly different from the truth of the Lord's creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The Persian king Cyrus is known for issuing the decree that allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem, as mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 verses 22 through 23. He attributed his decision to Marduk, stating that Marduk the great Lord established as his fate for me a magnanimous heart of one who loves Babylon, and I daily attended to his worship. I returned the images of the gods who had resided there in Babylon to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned to them their dwellings. Marduk, a god worshipped in ancient Babylon, was often depicted in mosaics standing with a dragon. The Ishtar Gate in Babylon had a striding dragon, known as Mushushu, which was associated with Marduk. It is interesting to note that Marduk was connected to a serpent-like creature, considering that the devil is often referred to as a serpent in the Bible. Genesis chapter 3 verse 1, verses 14 through 15, Revelation chapter 12 verse 9. Moreover, it is known that demons were the primary focus of idol worship in ancient Babylon. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 16 through 17. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods by denying him the honor and loyalty that is rightfully and uniquely his. And with repulsive acts they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons, not to God, to gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, whom your fathers never feared. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 20. On the contrary, the things which the Gentiles, pagans, sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons in effect and not to God. And I do not want you to become partners with demons by eating at feasts in pagan temples. Jeremiah and Isaiah were correct in their condemnation of Marduk. The Lord did bring judgment on Babylon, proving Marduk and all the other Babylonian gods to be false. There is only one true God, and He is the only one worthy of our worship. Isaiah chapter 45 verse 5. Nebuchadnezzar and Marduk. Through Genesis through Revelation, you'll encounter a number of kings in the Bible. One of the most potent kings mentioned in the Old Testament is King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He lived a dramatic, exciting life from his fiery furnace and giant golden idol. In ancient times, Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful monarch. Daniel chapter 2 verses 37 through 38. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the honor. And wherever the sons of mankind live, or the animals of the field or the birds of the sky, he has handed them over to you, and has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. During that time, he united the Babylonian Empire, the largest kingdom in the world. It extended from the Red Sea on the southern border, west to the Mediterranean Sea, north to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and east into Arabia. Using an atlas or world map, you can see the countries that would have been part of Nebuchadnezzar's empire today: Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and parts of Saudi Arabia. The capital city of Babylon, surrounded by great walls and deep canals, were considered unassailable, secure, unconquerable. Nebuchadnezzar constructed a magnificent hanging garden for his wife, as well as the temple of Marduk, which contained golden images of the pagan gods Baal and Ishtar. Babylon was a city of gold because Nebuchadnezzar used so much gold in his building projects. Besides being an accomplished builder and military leader, King Nebuchadnezzar was also a skilled builder. To expand his empire, he fought neighboring nations. Babylon was rebuilt into one of the most famous cities of its time under his leadership. In honor of pagan gods, he built hundreds of temples and altars. From the Middle Babylonian period, circa 1592 through 1155 BC onward, the name Anunnaki was applied generally to the deities of the underworld. Are the Anunnaki related to the Anakites? Many people ask, are the Anunnaki related to the Anakites as their names sound similar? No. Anunnaki means sons of An. While the terminology is the same, there is nothing in common between those two words. Anakim were the descendants of Anak. Joshua chapter 15 verse 13 states, Arba was the forefather of Anak. Kiriath Arba, also known as Hebron, was located in Judah and part of the land of Canaan. Many scholars have identified the Anakim as a remnant of Palestine's original inhabitants before the Canaanites, a Cushite tribe from Babel. The Anakim terrified the Israelites and were compared to giants. When the Israelites arrived in the Promised Land, God instructed them to scout the territory. 12 spies investigated the area and discovered the Anakim living there. Caleb believed the people could defeat the giants, but the other 11 men were skeptical. The spies spread negative information about the area to the rest of the Israelites. They were compared to grasshoppers in the Anakim's eyes. Caleb had Joshua on his side. Despite the Anakim's size and strength, he believed the Lord would come through and help his people take the Promised Land. The rest of the Israelites were skeptical. They moaned and grumbled, questioning God and his plan. The Lord sentenced the Israelites to 40 years of wandering in the desert because of their unbelief. Only Caleb and Joshua would enter the Promised Land, and every Israelite over the age of 20 would perish in the wilderness, he declared. After 40 years of wandering and Moses' death, it was time for the Israelites' forefathers to enter the Promised Land. The Anakim, on the other hand, remained in the area. Joshua and his army began defeating their enemies to claim the land that was promised to them. After many battles, the Anakim were the last people to be defeated. These earthly giants were no match for God's strength, and Joshua's army overtook them, killing them and taking their land. The only ones who remained were in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Finally, the Israelites were able to inherit the promised land. In Joshua chapter 14, Caleb recalls God's faithfulness and his promise to the people to inherit the land. Even though he is now 85 years old, he is determined to drive out the Anakim himself. Scholars have different views on the exact timeline of Caleb's conquest. According to one theory, Caleb defeated the Anakim while serving under Joshua's authority, as seen in Joshua chapter 11. The other viewpoint holds that the giants reappeared after the original battle, and Caleb drove them out once more. In either case, Caleb was able to drive them out of Hebron and inherit the land. The name Anakim most likely means long-necked, which translates to tall. The Hebrews believed they were descended from the Nephilim, a powerful race that ruled the pre-flood world. Fear gripped the Israelites, who saw themselves as grasshoppers in their sight. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. And they rebelled against God. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, refusing to enter the land God had promised them. Moses exhorted the Israelites not to be afraid of the Anakim. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 19. But they refused to believe God's promises. However, a small number of survivors sought refuge in the cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Many Bible scholars believe that the Anakim's descendants were the Philistine giants that David faced, including Goliath of Gath. After reviewing scripture, we can see that the Anakim and Nephilim are related, not interchangeable. Both beings were tall and feared by the people of the time. While the Nephilim are descended from demons or fallen angels, the Anakim are Anak's descendants with no supernatural ancestry. Both races, however, were evil enough to be exterminated by God and his people. God wants us to have faith in his faithfulness as well. It may not be how we prefer, but he will provide. Caleb and Joshua were rewarded for their faith by God. He wishes to bestow blessings on his children. Whatever obstacles may stand in our way, God wants us to believe that he is more powerful and that we can overcome through his strength. Number 2. Chemosh. Chemosh was the national deity of the Moabites, also revered by the Ammonites. Known as the Subduer, he held great importance in their religion. However, the religious customs associated with Chemosh involved barbaric rituals, which may have included human sacrifice. This practice was prevalent in many ancient religions. According to 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 13, King Solomon built an altar to worship Chemosh, a foreign deity, south of the Mount of Olives. The Hill of Corruption, located outside Jerusalem, was the site of this altar. This event highlights the challenges faced by Israelite kings in remaining faithful to Yahweh, the one true God, while confronting the influence of foreign gods. Chemosh was a deity worshipped by the Moabites, as mentioned in Numbers chapter 21, verse 29, and Jeremiah chapter 48, verses 7, 13, and 46. In the Bible, Chemosh is referred to as the abomination of Moab, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7. Unfortunately, King Solomon introduced the worship of Chemosh into Israelite culture, as he had wives from other cultures who led him astray to follow other gods. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 4 through 7. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away to follow other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David had been. For Solomon became a follower of Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and of Milcom, the abhorrent idol of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as his father David had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abhorrent idol of Moab, on the mountain that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abhorrent idol of the sons of Ammon. Chemosh was one of those gods worshipped by Solomon's wives. The cult of Chemosh was eventually destroyed in Judah by King Josiah. 2 Kings chapter 23. The name Chemosh has an uncertain meaning, but some scholars believe it might have referred to a destroyer or subduer. In addition, Chemosh was also recognized as a fish god. He was the national deity of the Moabites and the Ammonites. According to the Moabite stone, also known as the Meshastele, Chemosh was associated with the goddess Ashtoreth, who was another false god worshipped by Israelites. Chemosh is believed to have been a deity similar to Baal, and there is evidence from both the Moabite stone and scripture that suggests Chemosh might have been the same deity as the Ammonite Moloch. Number 3. Milcom. Milcom was the national deity of the Ammonites, and was often associated with divination, which is the practice of attempting to see into the future through supernatural means. The Bible considers divination a forbidden practice in worship. Furthermore, Milcom was sometimes associated with the abhorrent practice of child sacrifice, making the situation even worse. It is worth noting that during the later years of his reign, Solomon gave in to the temptation of worshiping Milcom and other false gods. The different variations of the god's name, such as Moloch, Molech, and Molech, show the various ways in which this false deity was perceived and worshipped. King Josiah conducted a holy convocation at the temple and read the words of the Book of the Covenant to all the people present. He stood by the pillar and made a covenant to obey all the words of the law. The people also joined him in the covenant with the Lord. King Josiah destroyed the idolatrous altars that were erected by Ahaz and Manasseh. Although Manasseh had removed these altars after his conversion, they were again used for idolatrous purposes by Ammon. King Josiah ensured that these altars would never be used again. He desecrated the high places on the southern end of the Mount of Olives, Mount of Corruption, which date back to the time of Solomon. He destroyed the altar that was at Bethel and burned the high place. Josiah was chosen before birth to fulfill a prophecy against an altar in Bethel. Number 4. Golden calves. The concept of golden calves makes two appearances in the Bible. Firstly, at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Aaron fashioned the golden calf, and secondly, during the reign of King Jeroboam, as described in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 26 through 30. After the Israelites had fled Egypt, Moses spent a significant amount of time on the mountain, receiving instructions from the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. However, the Israelites grew impatient and tired of waiting for him. They began to despise Moses, who was the one chosen by God to deliver them from slavery. It is unclear what happened to him. The Israelites demanded that Aaron create an idol to lead them in place of Moses and the Lord, which was a rejection of the first two commandments and a repudiation of their vow to obey the Lord. In the book of Exodus, it is recorded that the Israelites, after being rescued by God from slavery in Egypt, became impatient and asked Aaron to make them a god to worship. Tragically, Aaron listened to their request and instructed them to bring him gold, which he fashioned into the image of a calf. This was a significant choice because the Egyptians and Canaanites the original inhabitants of the land promised to Israel, were known for their deities shaped like calves. As a result, Israel turned away from the great I Am, who had rescued them, and instead worshipped a false god of the nations. They gave the praise that was due to God alone to a gold statue. Aaron declared that they would hold a festival to the Lord, and the people brought burnt and fellowship offerings. The people even referred to this idol as the Lord while performing sacrifices as prescribed by the true Lord. However, religious synthesis always leads to false religion. When idolatry is mixed with Christianity, Christianity is no longer the same. During the festival, the people sat down to eat and drink before getting up to party. However, this was not a harmless celebration. Its foundation was the rejection of the true God, and the party most likely incorporated corrupt cultic practices from other nations, such as drunkenness and immorality. Rather than accepting the idea of being the patriarch of a new nation without the existing Israelites, Moses begged God not to destroy Israel. He appealed not to their merit, but to God's reputation and character. First, Moses said the Egyptians would ridicule God's name and claim that he had brought Israel out only to kill them. Second, he reminded the Lord of his promise to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to raise up a great nation from their offspring. And as a result of Moses' intercession, the Lord relented and didn't totally destroy the Israelites. Sin is no joke. It brings death. Number 5. Dagon.
Who was Dagon? The Bible describes Dagon, also known as Dagon, as one of the oldest deities of Mesopotamia, with evidence dating back to 3000 BC, and he was represented as a half-man, half-fish creature. The god Dagon was regarded as the father of all other gods, so he was worshipped widely in what we call the cradle of civilization, where farming is thought to have first started, also the area some call the Fertile Crescent. Dagon's statue looked like a gigantic man. Some representations of him have him looking like a merman, which is a human with fish features below the waist. Some scholars have referred to him as a fish god, which makes sense given his association with the Philistines and their location along the coast. In the Bible, the Philistines continued to worship Dagon during the time of the Judges, as well as during the reigns of Samuel and Saul. As a biblical connection, ancient texts from the region connect Dagon as the father of Baal, another false god highlighted throughout later Old Testament history. The gods of the Old Testament were nothing more than demons masquerading as gods, and all idolatry is ultimately devil worship. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20. No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. Dagon was similar to many other idols in that he personified natural forces that had supposedly produced all things. All through history, and right into the days that we now live, humans have always been fascinated with demon-driven gods to do what looks extraordinary. This temptation hasn't been limited to the heathen that have no knowledge of God, but has also crept into the hearts of those who once loved and knew the God that made the seen or unseen world. This longing to seek gods often stems from greed, rebellion, or a soul that is too impatient and feels God is too slow for the supernatural change he desires. Psalm chapter 16, verses 2-5. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you I have no good thing. I say of the holy people who are in the land, they are the noble ones in whom is all my delight. Those who run after other gods will suffer more and more. I will not pour out libations of blood to such gods, or take up their names on my lips. Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. What happened to Dagon in the Bible? There are two primary passages in the Old Testament that make reference to Dagon. The story can be found in Judges chapter 16 as a component of the Samson narrative. God chose Samson to be one of the deliverers or judges, and he used his renowned power to triumph over the Philistines at every stage of the conflict. The Philistines were unable to defeat him in combat, so they targeted his Achilles heel, his relationships with foreign women. The famed Delilah coaxed Samson's secret confession out of him and made him cut off his hair, leading him to be taken captive by the Philistines. As they worshipped Dagon and had a big party, they decided to humiliate Samson by putting out his eyes and making him work as a slave. Clearly, this was part of their worship of Dagon. Judges chapter 16 verses 23 and 24. Now the Philistine lords gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to celebrate. For they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw Samson, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has handed over our enemy to us, the ravager of our country who has killed many of us." When nations went to war in polytheistic cultures, it was also understood that their gods fought, and the Old Testament confirms this in many passages with Israel and other cultures. With Samson, the Philistines were making a statement. Due to the capture of Samson, they believed Dagon had beaten Jehovah, Samson's god, and therefore Dagon was stronger than the God of Israel. Judges chapter 16 verses 25 to 30. Now when they were in high spirits, they said, "Call for Samson, so that he may amuse us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the roof of the house rests, so that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the Philistine lords were there. And on the flat roof were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson was entertaining them. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this one time. O God, and let me take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson took hold of the 2 middle support pillars on which the house rested, and braced himself against them, one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he stretched out with all his might, collapsing the support pillars, and the house fell on the lords and on all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Samson's plea to God to help him destroy the Philistines makes sense. God's assistance was not about Samson so much as proving which God was stronger. 1 Samuel chapter 5 is where we find the next instance of Dagon being dealt with. The sons of Eli the priest and commander of Israel were wicked religious men, and despite the fact that the Ark of the Covenant went into battle with Israel against the Philistines, God handed Israel a defeat as punishment. The Philistines succeeded in stealing the Ark of the Covenant from its previous owners, in a manner identical to that which had occurred with Samson. The Philistines brought the Ark into the temple of one of their city-states, Ashdod. 1 Samuel chapter 5 verses 1 to 7. Then the Philistines took the ark of God, and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. They took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon, and set it beside the image of Dagon, their chief idol. When the people of Ashdod got up early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. But when they got up early the next morning, behold, Dagon had again fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and his head and both palms of his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk portion of the idol of Dagon was left on him. This is the reason neither the priests of Dagon nor any who entered Dagon's house step on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Then the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he caused them to be dumbfounded and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. When the men of Ashdod saw what had happened, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is heavy on us and on Dagon our God." As a mark of their success, they displayed the ark by placing it at the base of the massive statue of Dagon. Dagon had beat Jehovah, right? It didn't last long. Then they sent the ark to the city of Ekron. You guessed correctly. More people developed tumors and passed away as a result. The people of Philistia pleaded with their officials to return the ark to Israel, and their leaders complied with their request, pointing out that they shouldn't be as obstinate as Pharaoh had been in Egypt. They loaded the ark onto a cart that was driven by 2 animals, and then they set it out. The oxen eventually made it back to Israel, even though there was no one driving them. Despite the worldview of the Philistines, the defeat of Israel wasn't a defeat of their God. God didn't need the army of Israel to fight for him. He won, all on his own. It seems as if God has a sense of humor when we read the story of Dagon in the Bible. Here and in Isaiah, we see how God deals with false worship twice, when he speaks of cutting wood for a fire and then bowing down to it. In the Isaiah excerpt, God said, "He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself or say, 'Is there not a lie in my right hand?'" How was Dagon worshipped? Dagon was worshipped in temples that could be found all over Mesopotamia. According to the Bible, the cities of Beth Dagon, Gaza, and Ashdod were home to some of the most important temples. He was worshipped by offering offerings and participating in feasts. Even though he is not specifically named by name, Dagon plays an important role in the book of Jonah. The Ninevites, who were of Assyrian origin, primarily honored Dagon, the god of fish, as well as Nanshi, a goddess associated with fish. When they had a prophet approach their gates who had lived in a fish for 3 days only to have been brought to them to tell them to repent of their ways, they were ready to listen. His temple is destroyed. His image is laid prostrate before the ark of God with his hands and face cut off, demonstrating that he is powerless to resist the God of the Israelites. And his creature, which is a fish, complies with the will of God by swallowing and spitting out a prophet who is on his way to Dagon's people to tell them to repent and turn back to the true God. We need to be cautious about what we allow to infiltrate our lives. The Bible doesn't really mention if the Israelites engaged in Dagon worship. However, we know they dabbled with Dagon's gods, Baal and Asherah, so we can assume they threw a little Dagon in there. The seemingly innocuous can turn out to be insidious, so we must exercise extreme caution.
The other gods. In the ancient times, people used to worship gods associated with natural elements, such as wind, fire, and water. However, in today's world, we face various distractions that lead us away from spiritual values. Our contemporary society is characterized by a desire for immediate gratification, convenience, and a dependence on technology. Amidst these influences, it is effortless to overlook our spiritual roots and prioritize other aspects of life over our connection with God. Here are a few things that the Bible warns us to be aware of. Money. The pursuit of wealth, seeking security and status, can sometimes become all-consuming. When money takes center stage, it can lead to feelings of discontent and selfishness. As Jesus wisely said, "Where you invest your treasure, that's where your heart will be." Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. Pleasure. Our society places a significant emphasis on seeking pleasure, often through activities like partying and shopping. However, relying solely on these pursuits may bring only temporary satisfaction and can potentially lead to harmful behaviors. The Bible reminds us that there's a right time for every activity. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. Power. The desire for power, to feel important or control others, can have detrimental consequences, including oppression and corruption. True strength, as the Bible tells us, comes from God, especially when we are at our weakest. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10. And he has said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness." Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in distresses, in persecutions, in difficulties, in behalf of Christ, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Pride. Putting too much emphasis on personal achievements or appearance can foster a false sense of superiority. The Bible encourages humility before the Lord, assuring that humility leads to elevation. Self. The temptation to prioritize personal desires over God's purpose is a common struggle. Acknowledging that we are made in God's image for His glory is crucial. The Bible instructs us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. It is important to remember that in today's fast-paced world, we can easily lose sight of our spiritual foundations. The distractions of instant gratification, convenience, and technology can lead us away from the things that truly matter. Therefore, let us put in effort to keep God at the center of our lives, ensuring that our priorities align with our spiritual well-being. Throughout the Bible, the theme of God's supremacy emerges, emphasizing the inadequacy of false gods when measured against the Almighty's power. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 35 through 36, a profound declaration unfolds, underscoring Yahweh's exclusive status as the singular true God. The verses vividly recount instances where Yahweh revealed Himself through extraordinary manifestations, from His voice resonating from the heavens to the manifestation of His great fire on earth. These experiences served as unequivocal proof that there is no deity beside Yahweh. Further reinforcing the significance of exclusive devotion to Yahweh, Exodus chapter 20, verse 3 explicitly commands, "You shall have no other gods before me." This commandment serves as a fundamental principle, urging adherence to the singular worship of the one true God. The gravity of this command is reiterated in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 14, where a stern admonition is delivered against following the gods of the surrounding nations, The passage warns that Yahweh, being a jealous God, demands undivided allegiance, and straying from this commitment may incur his wrath, leading to potential consequences, even expulsion from the promised land. What is the definition of idolatry? Idolatry can be defined as the worship of idols or excessive devotion to or reverence for some person or thing, according to Webster's dictionary. In other words, an idol is anything that replaces the one true God. During Bible times, the most common form of idolatry was the worship of images that were believed to embody various pagan deities. Some religions still practice idolatry by bowing before statues or icons, despite it being forbidden in God's Word. This is reflected in the first of the Ten Commandments. Idolatry is not only limited to the worship of statues, images, and false gods. In modern times, we have created our own idols. These include pride, self-centeredness, greed, gluttony, and an excessive love for possessions. Ultimately, this leads to rebellion against God. It is no surprise that God despises it. Why is idol worship such a powerful temptation? The answer to this is sin. We worship modern idols because of our sinful nature. Resisting the glorification of idols is a battle of the redeemed. When we hear the word idol, we usually think of statues and things reminiscent of those glorified by pagans in age-old cultures. However, the idols of the modern world often bear no likeness to the artifacts used thousands of years ago. In today's society, many people's Asherah has been replaced by an unquenchable desire for acceptance in the eyes of the world. In the end, it doesn't matter what empty pleasure we chase after or what idol or false god we bow down to. The result is the same. This is because there is only one God, and all other gods are false. Understanding contemporary idols can help us understand why they are a powerful temptation. Anything we place ahead of God in our lives can be an idol. Clearly, some of the things we idolize are sinful. As we vigorously pursue our idols, we often push God aside. We rarely spend time with God because we spend so much on these idolatrous pursuits. We sometimes also turn to idols seeking solace from the hardships of life and the turmoil present in our world. Behaviors may be used to temporarily escape a challenging situation or the rigors of daily life. We need to place our trust in the Lord, who will keep us from all harm, and who has promised to supply all of our needs when we trust in Him. We also need to remember the words of Paul, who teaches us not to be anxious about anything, but rather to pray about everything, so the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, can guard our hearts and minds. The good things of this world are gifts from God, meant to be enjoyed with a thankful heart, in submission to Him and for His glory. Nevertheless, when the gift replaces the giver, or the created replaces the creator, we have fallen into idolatry. No idol can give us eternal hope or meaning in our lives. In pursuit of idols, we will be left empty, unsatisfied, and eventually on the road that leads to destruction. God despises idolatry completely. It brings God's wrath down on those involved. Idolatry brings curses upon the people and the land. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. Idolatry incites God's wrath. It defiles and pollutes people and the land. So, to answer the question, why are idols dangerous? Specifically, God's wrath is falling on idolatry. Nothing is more terrifying than the wrath of an all-powerful, all-righteous God. And according to Paul, God's wrath is coming on idolatry. God's wrath falls on the idolater because God is jealous. There are two kinds of jealousy: righteous and holy jealousy, and unrighteous, weak, and insecure jealousy. What exactly is an idol, and how does it appear today? First and foremost, in the heart. Covetousness, which is idolatry, Paul says. Thus, idolatry today is the activity of the human heart. This is not a bodily act. Then there's a fruit on a branch. It all starts in the heart, craving, wanting, enjoying, and being satisfied by anything other than God. This is what Paul calls covetousness, a disordered love or desire, loving more than God what should be loved less than God and only for God's sake. But this disordered heart is in a state of covetousness, which is an act of loving too much which should be loved less. That is how idolatry appears today. Idolatry begins in the heart, craving, wanting, enjoying, and being satisfied by anything more valuable than God. Finally, what exactly is an idol? That is the issue. It is the thing or person that was loved more than God, desired more than God, treasured more than God, and enjoyed more than God. It might be good grades. It could be other people's approval. It could be a commercial success. It could be a hobby, a musical group, a sport, or your meticulously maintained yard. Your own appearance could be an idol. Anything could happen. So Paul puts it like this in Romans chapter 1, verse 25. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature, anything that is created, rather than the Creator, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. In closing, our question of the day is, which Bible character inspires you? Put your answers in the comments. The gods of the Old Testament were nothing more than demons masquerading as gods, and all idolatry is ultimately devil worship. Throughout history, and right into the days that we now live, humans have always been fascinated with demon-driven gods to do what looks extraordinary. This temptation hasn't been limited to the heathen without knowledge of God, but has also crept into the hearts of those who once loved and knew the God that made the unseen world. This longing to see gods often stems from greed, rebellion, or a too impatient soul who feels God is too slow for the supernatural change he desires. We need to be cautious about what we allow to infiltrate our lives.
Strangest gods and idols in the Bible. Number 1. The Nehushtan, the bronze serpent, its origins and fate. Following their deliverance from Egypt, the people began to complain to God about the conditions of their lives, and as a direct response, God dispersed among them fiery serpents. Many of the people ended up passing away, and many more were dying. Numbers 21, 4-9, New American Standard Bible. Then they set out from the Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient because of the journey. So the people spoke against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we are disgusted with this miserable food." Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. So the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned because we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord that he will remove the serpents from us." And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and put it on a flagpole, and it shall come about that everyone who is bitten and looks at it will live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on the flagpole, and it came about that if a serpent bit someone and he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. The difficult trek that was designed to bypass the hostile Edom frustrated the Israelites, and as a result, they reverted to their favorite complaint against God and Moses. "Why have you led us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness?" For 40 years, God had preserved them. They were protected by God for a period of 40 years. It would be inappropriate at this moment to presume the worst about him. So since they were determined to complain about dying, God gave them something to actually complain about. He sent poisonous snakes. The carpet viper is a highly poisonous viper known from Africa and the Middle East, thus a likely candidate. Other suggestions include the puff adder and sand viper, neither of which is as lethal as the carpet viper. Even among miracles, this was unusual. There was no immediate logical connection between merely glancing at a serpent mounted on a pole and the ability to live, or refusing to look and dying. But God commanded that such an unusual thing be used to bring salvation to Israel. This is interesting. As we see in Genesis and Revelation, the serpent is frequently employed as a symbol of evil throughout the Bible. Many years later, something strange happened. In the time between Moses and Hezekiah, the Israelites began worshipping the fiery serpent, Moses made out of bronze. 2 Kings 18:4. This shows us how easy it is for us to take the things of God and twist them into idolatry. Although the bronze serpent was referenced in relation to Hezekiah's reforms, it is possible that the worship of Nehushtan had been occurring prior to his reign. When Hezekiah took power, Judah was almost completely ruled by Assyria. His reign was one of great reform. He led a campaign against all kinds of idolatry, destroying even the high places and the bronze serpent from Numbers 21. He gave it the name Nehushtan, which means a bronze thing in Hebrew. Hezekiah was the best king of Judah because he put his trust in the Lord God more than any other king. 2 Kings 18:4, Amplified Bible. He removed the high places of pagan worship, broke down the images, memorial stones, and cut down the Asherim. He also crushed the pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the Israelites had burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan, a bronze sculpture. Even though it is easy to see how something that brought miraculous healing could become an object of worship, it was still blatant disobedience to God's commands. The bronze serpent was God's method of deliverance during the incident recorded in Number 21. There is not the slightest hint that God ever intended for it to have any further application. It's interesting to note that a literal translation of the word Nehushtan is piece of brass. It's possible that Hezekiah gave it the name Nehushtan so that people would be reminded that it was just a piece of brass. It did not contain any power at all. Even in the situation described in Numbers 21, it was God who brought about healing, not Nehushtan. A powerful lesson for all of us to learn from Nehushtan is that even good things and good people have the potential to become idols in our lives. All of our adoration, praise, and thanksgiving should be directed solely towards God. Nothing else, regardless of its amazing history, is worthy. Jesus indicated that this bronze serpent was a foreshadowing of him. The serpent, a symbol of sin and judgment, was lifted up from the earth and put on a tree, which was a symbol of a curse. The raised and cursed serpent was a picture of Jesus, who takes away sin from anyone who looks to him in faith, just like the Israelites had to look to the symbol in the desert. God saved the people by sending the bronze snake. There's no sign that God ever planned for it to be used again. Number 2. Golden calf. The golden calf. This idol is strange, as it was created by a man that was a righteous spiritual leader. In Exodus 32, there was an unusual event that happened after the Israelites escaped from Egypt. According to the Bible, God miraculously parted the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to pass through while the Egyptians were pursuing them. Once the Israelites had safely crossed the other side, God caused the sea to close back up, drowning the pursuing Egyptians. During Moses' absence on Mount Sinai, retrieving the Ten Commandments, the Israelites committed an action that is commonly seen in the Old Testament. They became irritated. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up from Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Exodus 32:1. Moses was on the mountain for a long time, receiving instructions from the Lord. 40 days and 40 nights, in fact. That was apparently too long for the Israelites. They were tired of waiting and were impatient. They despised the one whom God used to deliver them from slavery. This Moses, we don't know what happened to him. They also demanded that Aaron create an idol to lead them in Moses' and the Lord's place, a rejection of the first 2 commandments and a repudiation of their vow to obey the Lord. Exodus 32:2-4, New American Standard Bible. Aaron said to them, "Tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then he took the gold from their hands and fashioned it with an engraving tool and made it into a cast metal calf. And they said, "This is your God Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Tragically, Aaron listened to them and told them to bring him gold, which he fashioned into the image of a calf. This decision holds significance as the Egyptians and Canaanites, who were the initial occupants of the land promised to Israel, worshipped calf-shaped deities. As a result, Israel scorned the great I Am who had rescued them and instead worshipped a false god of the nations. The praise that was due to God alone was bestowed upon a gold statue. Exodus 32:5-6. Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." So the next day they got up early and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink, and got up to engage in lewd behavior. Aaron declared that they would hold a festival to the Lord, and the people brought burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. It's important to remember that the people performing sacrifices to this idol referred to it as the Lord, despite the fact that the true Lord had prescribed different practices. Religious synthesis always leads to false religion. When idolatry is mixed with Christianity, Christianity is no longer the same. People sat down to eat and drink before getting up to party. They were clearly not having a harmless celebration. Its foundation was rejection of the true God, and the party most likely incorporated corrupt cultic practices from other nations, such as drunkenness and immorality. Paul quotes this verse when he warns the Corinthians, "Don't become idolaters." Moses had been on the mountain for days in God's presence and was completely unaware of what was going on. God informed Moses that Moses' people, notice he did not say my people, had acted corruptly and had quickly abandoned God in favor of idol worship. The Lord declared that they were a stiff-necked people who would be destroyed. After all, he would be able to turn Moses into a great nation instead. Moses didn't want to become the patriarch of a new nation without the Israelites. Instead, he pleaded with God to spare them from destruction. He didn't make the appeal based on their worthiness, but on God's reputation and character. Moses descended the mountain carrying the 2 tablets inscribed with God's writing. While Joshua was on the mountain with Moses, he heard commotion coming from the Israelite camp and mistakenly thought an enemy invasion caused it. But Moses was wiser. Moses was filled with anger when he witnessed the people dancing around the calf. This led him to break the tablets in disappointment, as Israel had broken the covenant made by God with them in a short span of time. The Israelites were made to drink the powder of a burnt calf, which was a consequence of their sin. Exodus 32:21-24. Then Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you, that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" And Aaron said, "Do not let the anger of my Lord burn. You know the people yourself, that they are prone to evil. For they said to me, 'Make a god for us who will go before us.' For this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him. So I said to them, 'Whoever has any gold, let them tear it off.' Then they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Moses had a confrontation with his brother Aaron, who was tasked with leading Israel to know and obey God. However, Aaron led them into committing a serious sin. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, Aaron shifted the blame to the people, as if they coerced him into it. Then he made this absurd claim: "When I threw the gold into the fire, this calf came out." As a result, he falsely implied that the idol was created supernaturally. Moses recognized that the people were out of control. Despite the fact that he had confronted them with their sin, many remained unrepentant. So he exclaimed, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." When the Levites gathered around him in response, Moses dispatched them to carry out God's judgment on those who continued to practice idolatry and immorality. As a result, 3,000 men were killed within a short period of time. Sin is no joke. It brings death. The next day, Moses reminded the people of their sin and declared that he would intercede with God on their behalf. This is followed by another remarkable example of intercessory prayer in the Bible. Moses confessed the people's sin and pleaded for their forgiveness. If God refused to forgive them, Moses requested that God destroy him instead of them. He was ready to give his life for this ungrateful, sinful people. Number 3. Artemis. Artemis was a goddess worshipped in the ancient world. According to Greek mythology, she was the twin sister of Apollo and was considered the goddess of hunting, wilderness, and the protector of unmarried women. The Artemis referred to in the book of Acts was not the same as the Greek goddess of mythology who shares her name. Rather, she was a localized goddess specific to the region of Ephesus, known as Diana in Latin. Her temple in Ephesus was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The deity known as Ephesian Artemis was worshipped as a queen of heaven, with a focus on fertility and the safeguarding of childbearing. Numerous images of her have been discovered through excavation. In the temple, numerous priests and priestesses conducted animal sacrifices. It is unclear if the priestess practiced ritual prostitution, but regardless, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was a well-liked destination for tourists during the Roman era. A unique mythology sprang up around the origin of Artemis worship. The account is hinted to be the city clerk of Ephesus. Acts 19:35, New American Standard Bible. After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what person is there after all who does not know what the city of the Ephesians is guarding of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from the sky?" One commonly sold item to tourists is a tiny Artemis shrine, an enclosed cup with a small female figure inside. The worshippers are advised that they can take this portable shrine anywhere in the world and worship Artemis in front of it. Paul spent years in Ephesus and performed extraordinary miracles there, as the gospel made inroads into territory claimed by Artemis. The stage was set for a confrontation with the spiritual forces of darkness. As the followers of Artemis noticed the difference Paul's preaching was having in their city, there arose a great disturbance about the way. Acts 19:23. About that time, a major disturbance occurred in regard to the way. In the center of Artemis worship, in a city known for paganism, immorality and greed, the light of Jesus Christ shone brightly. Despite the enemy's intimidations, the church thrived. Baal. Who was Baal? Baal was the name of the god who was worshipped throughout Canaan and Phoenicia in ancient times. During the Judges period, the practice of Baal worship entered Jewish religious life. Judges 3:7, New American Standard Bible. So the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherah. The practice of Baal worship became widespread in Israel during the reign of Ahab, and the practice of Baal worship also affected Judah. Baal was a fertility god, thought to help the earth produce crops and people produce offspring in general. Various parts worshipped Baal in different methods, and Baal proved to be a highly universal god. Different religions emphasized different attributes of Baal and created unique sects based on them. In Numbers 25:3 and Judges 8:33, we can observe the existence of local deities, such as Baal of Peor and Baal Berith. The word Baal appears infrequently in the Old Testament as a personal name. These local Baals were thought to be in charge of agriculture, creatures, and humanity's fertility. It was crucial to winning their favor, especially in a place like Baal, where few natural streams or springs and rainfall is unpredictable. This led to adopting extreme forms into the cults, including ritual prostitution and child sacrifice. Jeremiah 7:9, New King James Version. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense to Baal, and walk after other gods whom you do not know? Baal is depicted in the sculptures wearing a helmet embellished with a bull's horns, a symbol of strength and fertility. In one hand he carries a club or mace, likely symbolizing thunder, while in the other hand he holds a spear decorated with leaves, which could signify both lightning and vegetation. In ancient times, Baal was regarded as the most dominant god, overshadowing El, who was perceived as feeble and inadequate. The Canaanites worshipped Baal as the sun god and as the storm god. He is usually depicted holding a lightning bolt, who defeated enemies and produced crops. They also worshipped him as a fertility god who provided children. Baal worship was rooted in sensuality and involved ritualistic prostitution in the temples. At times, appeasing Baal required human sacrifice, usually the firstborn of the one making the sacrifice. Jeremiah 19:5, King James Version. They have built also the high places of Baal, to burn their sons with fire for burnt offerings unto Baal, which I commanded not, nor spake it, neither came it into my mind. Baal's priests worshipped their deity with riotous rites that featured ecstatic shouts and self-inflicted harm. 1 Kings 18:28. Before the Hebrews entered the Promised Land, the Lord gave forewarned against glorifying Canaan's God, but Israel bent to idolism anyway. Deuteronomy 6:14-15, King James Version. Ye shall not go after other gods, of the gods of the people which are rounded about you. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from off the face of the earth. During the reign of Ahab and Jezebel, at the height of Baal worship in Israel, God directly confronted the paganism through his prophet Elijah. First, God showed that he, not Baal, controlled the rain by sending a drought lasting 3.5 years. The stage was set for a showdown on Mount Carmel between 850 Baal prophets and one God prophet. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" Elijah challenged the audience. "If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him." Here was Elijah's dare. Let's have a competition. Let the God who is God respond with fire from heaven. That was a reasonable test. Baal, the storm god, should be able to send down some lightning. Elijah gave them every advantage before mocking their futile efforts. Baal's prophets spent hours pleading, shouting, and cutting themselves, but he didn't respond. Then Elijah prepared the sacrifice before asking God to show his people his glory. Fire fell and consumed the sacrifice, the water, and the altar as soon as he said his prayer. People fell to their knees, yelling, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord is God!" They couldn't help but notice that God was alive and well. But the Lord wasn't done yet. He reactivated the rain spigot. Elijah prayed 7 times in a row before the rain began to fall. Elijah, drenched, dashed down the mountain. He demonstrated that God is alive and well. God is alive and well. You can demonstrate it both privately and publicly in your life. Finally, in Matthew 12:27, Jesus refers to Satan as Beelzebub, a reference to the Philistine god. The Baalim of the Old Testament were nothing more than demons masquerading as gods, and all the idolatry is ultimately devil worship. 1 Corinthians 10:20. "No, I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons." Nebuchadnezzar's statue. This event is strange, as this is when King Nebuchadnezzar saw Jesus. Imagine you're a king 603 years before Christ, and you saw Jesus face to face. What would you do? Many people don't even know that Jesus was in the Old Testament. This event occurs in the book of Daniel. The events of the book take place in Babylon, a region that was ruled by Nebuchadnezzar, who was a proud and cruel tyrant who took great pleasure in torturing his victims. He ruled the ancient world as an absolute dictator. After subduing Assyria, he set his sights on Egypt, his principal adversary at the time. Because Judah was in the way, it would be necessary to get rid of it if he wanted to fulfill his ambition of ruling over a large empire. Nebuchadnezzar issued an order to have a large number of Jewish young men trained to serve him in the capacity of men of knowledge and wisdom. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were among those who were taken captive. They were known by the names Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Chaldean. The image of God. King Nebuchadnezzar gave the order for the creation of a colossal statue made of gold. The gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar had commissioned must have been magnificent. It stood 90 feet tall. It's possible that the king planned it so that he could consolidate his power by bringing together all levels of his officials for a grand ceremony. These rulers were to attend the dedication of the statue erected by King Nebuchadnezzar and fall face down in worship of it. Everyone who disobeyed this command ran the risk of being cast into a burning furnace and being burnt to a crisp. Everyone obeyed Nebuchadnezzar's orders because he was determined to establish himself not only as the uncontested political leader of Babylon, but also as the supreme religious authority in the city. Or at the very least, almost everyone. Due to the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among the officials that were present at the massive gathering, a confrontation was unavoidable. 3 of the men in the room did not bow down, even though everyone else in the room did. Many people cannot imagine that social pressure. It was not an easy fit. When Nebuchadnezzar found out about the situation, he immediately flew into a rage. It's surprising that he gave the accused a chance to respond to the charges leveled against them. That he did may indicate his regard for them. But make no mistake, the king would accept only one response: total concession. They had 2 options. either worship the enormous gold idol or perish in the fire. Despite his earlier praise for the Hebrew God, Nebuchadnezzar added, "Who is the God who can deliver you from my power?" The king's question, as before, would be answered eventually. Daniel 3:13-14. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, gave a command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up?" These valiant Jewish men defied the king's direct order and placed themselves in the hands of God. Their response is quite impressive. Daniel 3:16-18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." In other words, they said, "We'd rather fear our God than your furnace any day. Even if he decided to let us burn, we will still serve the living God rather than your dead idol." Priceless. They preferred death to unfaithfulness to God, and had no doubt planned for the possibility of this day for a long time. It's hard to fathom how angry Nebuchadnezzar was when his authority was challenged, but reportedly his face turned red with fury. In response, he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than normal. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tossed into the flames, the radiant heat was so great, the men carrying them were killed. No doubt, wearing flammable clothing, the faithful Hebrews had no hope, unless hope itself intervened. Daniel 3:19-25, New King James Version. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." When Nebuchadnezzar saw the men walking around in the fire, not only did he find it unbelievable that they were unharmed, but he also found it unbelievable that there were 4 of them. The 4th appeared to be God's Son, implying that he was pre-incarnate Christ. Nebuchadnezzar tells us who the 4th person was: the Son of God. During the most difficult part of their ordeal, Jesus was there with them physically. Amid their ordeal in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego may or may not have been aware that the Son of God was with them. Although there are times when we are conscious of Jesus' presence in our afflictions, and other times we are not, we should never doubt that he is present. God is able to strike with astonishment those individuals whose hearts are most hardened against him and his people. He that made the soul can make his sword to approach to it, even to that of the greatest tyrant. When the king realized that the men he had sentenced had been divinely rescued, he summoned them, and not a single hair on their head had been scorched in the process. Being thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's deadly fire, had proven to be a piece of cake. Number 6. Asherah. Who was Asherah, or Ashtoreth? In the Bible, Asherah, or Ashtoreth, is the name of a pagan fertility goddess and a wooden cult object devoted to her. In the Bible, Asherah is almost always referred to as a sacred pole erected in honor of the fertility goddess. Scripture also references carved images of Asherah. The name Asherah means she who enriches. In Ugaritic literature, she was called Lady Asherah of the Sea. She was believed to be worshipped in ancient Syria, Phoenicia, and Canaan. She was worshipped by the Phoenicians as Astarte, the Assyrians as Ishtar, and the Philistines as Asherah. As soon as Joshua died, Asherah worship plagued Israel due to Israel's complicated conquest of Canaan. Judges 2:13. So they abandoned the Lord and served Baal, the pagan god of the Canaanites, and the Asheroth. The nation of Israel was in a state of compromise in Judges 1. Initially, they had fought the pagan culture of the Canaanites. Then they feared it, and then they coexisted with it peacefully. Some might say that this was only a little disobedience compared to everything God had commanded. Still, God does not consider minor disobedience regarding his precise commands. People are always called to be different by God. It was God's standard for Israel to be different from the nations around them, but they had not obeyed. Sin always hurts. It always shackles. Joshua had faith in God and believed in his promises. Because of the leadership of Joshua, his generation knew the Lord. However, generations come and go. The new generation didn't know God. The nation began with incomplete obedience and compromise. Instead of driving out the Canaanites, they were affected by that heathen nation's perverse pagan worship. Asherah was characterized by a limbless tree trunk planted in the ground. The trunk was typically carved into a symbolic representation of the goddess. As a result of the connection with carved trees, the places of Asherah worship were commonly called groves. He placed the carved Asherah pole he made in the temple among King Manasseh's evil acts. Considered the moon goddess, Asherah was often presented as a consort of Baal. Asherah was also worshipped as the goddess of love and war and sometimes linked with Anath, another Canaanite goddess. The cult of Asherah was notorious for its sensuality and involved ritual prostitution. In addition to this, divination and telling fortunes were also practices that the priests and priestesses of Asherah carried out. A detailed description of Asherah, or an Asherah pole, is not provided in the Old Testament, nor is the origin of Asherah worship described. In Canaan, sacred sites and altars were adorned with Asherah poles. 1 Kings 14:23. For they also built for themselves high places to worship idols, and sacred pillars and Asherim for the goddess Asherah. These were on every high hill and under every luxuriant tree. The city of Tyre on the Mediterranean coast was home to the best cedars of Lebanon and was an important center for worshipping Asherah. The Jewish law explicitly forbade reverence of Asherah. Deuteronomy 16:21. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree or wood beside the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make. Judges 6:26 depicts the collapse of an Asherah pole by using it to fuel the fire of a sacrificial offering to the Lord. Judges 6:26. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this mountain stronghold, with stones laid down in an orderly way. Then take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice using the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down. A famous Asherah pole stood in Samaria in the days of King Jehoash. Manasseh, king of Judah, heeded the despicable practices of pagan nations. He reconstructed the high places and set up altars for Baal and the Asherah pole. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and even made a carved image of Asherah and set it up in the temple. 2 Kings 21:7. He made a carved image of the goddess Asherah and set it up in the house, temple, of which the Lord said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this house and in Jerusalem, in the tribe of Judah, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." During the reign of Josiah, the high priest Hilkiah cleansed the temple of all images depicting the goddess Asherah. One reason Israel fell to the Assyrians was God's anger over their worship of Asherah and Baal. Despite God's clear instructions, Asherah worship was a perennial problem in Israel. As Solomon slipped into idolatry, one of the pagan deities he brought into the kingdom was Asherah, called the goddess of the Sidonians. At times, Israel experienced a revival, and King Josiah led notable crusades against Asherah worship. Number 7. Dagon. Who was Dagon? The Bible describes Dagon, also known as Dagon, as one of the oldest deities in Mesopotamia, with evidence dating back to 3000 BC, and he was represented as a half-man, half-fish creature. The god Dagon was regarded as the father of all other gods, so he was worshipped widely in what we call the cradle of civilization, where farming is thought to have first started. Also the area some call the Fertile Crescent. Dagon's statue looked like a gigantic man. Some representations of him have him looking like a merman, which is a human with fish features below the waist. Some scholars have referred to him as a fish god, which makes sense given his association with the Philistines and their location along the coast. In the Bible, the Philistines continued to worship Dagon during the time of the Judges, as well as during the reign of Samuel and Saul. As a biblical connection, ancient texts from the region connect Dagon as the father of Baal, another false god highlighted throughout later Old Testament history. What happened to Dagon in the Bible? There are two primary messages in the Old Testament that make reference to Dagon. The story can be found in Judges chapter 16 as a component of the Samson narrative. God chose Samson to be one of the deliverers, or judges, and he used his renowned power to triumph over the Philistines at every stage of the conflict. The Philistines were unable to defeat him in combat, so they targeted his Achilles heel, his relationship with foreign women. The famed Delilah coaxed Samson's secret confession out of him and made him cut off his hair, leading to him being taken captive by the Philistines. As they worshipped Dagon and had a big party, they decided to humiliate Samson by putting out his eyes and making him work as a slave. Clearly, this was part of their worship of Dagon. When nations went to war in polytheistic cultures, it was also understood that their gods fought, and the Old Testament confirms this in many passages with Israel and other cultures. With Samson, the Philistines were making a statement. Due to the capture of Samson, they believed Dagon had beaten Jehovah, Samson's god, and therefore Dagon was stronger than the God of Israel. However, Samson made a plea to God and brought the entire structure down. Samson's plea to God to help him destroy the Philistines makes sense. God's assistance was not about Samson so much as proving which god was stronger. 1 Samuel 5 is where we find the next instance of Dagon being dealt with. The Philistines succeeded in stealing the Ark of the Covenant from its previous owners. In a manner identical to that which had occurred with Samson, the Philistines brought the Ark into the temple of one of their city-states, Ashdod. 1 Samuel 5, 1-7, Amplified Bible. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. They took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it beside the image of Dagon, their chief idol. When the people of Ashdod got up early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face on the ground before the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. But when they got up early the next morning, behold, Dagon had again fallen on his face on the ground before the Ark of the Lord, and his head and both palms of his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk portion of the idol of Dagon was left on him. This is the reason neither the priests of Dagon nor any who enter Dagon's house step on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Then the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he caused them to be dumbfounded and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. When the men of Ashdod saw what happened, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is heavy on us and on Dagon our God." As a mark of their success, they displayed the ark by placing it at the base of the massive statue of Dagon. Dagon had beat Jehovah, right? It didn't last long. Then they sent the ark to the city of Ekron. Yes, you guessed correctly. More people developed tumors and passed away as a result. The people of Philistia pleaded with their officials to return the ark to Israel, and their leaders complied with their request, pointing out that they shouldn't be as obstinate as Pharaoh had been in Egypt. They loaded the ark onto a cart that was driven by 2 animals, and then they set it out. The oxen eventually made it back to Israel, even though there was no one driving them. Despite the worldview of the Philistines, the defeat of Israel wasn't a defeat of their God. God didn't need the army of Israel to fight for him. He won all on his own. It seems as if God has a sense of humor when we read the story of Dagon in the Bible. Here, and in Isaiah, we see how God deals with false worship twice, when he speaks of cutting wood for a fire and then bowing down to it. In the Isaiah excerpt, God said, "He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself or say, 'Is there not a lie in my right hand?'" Dagon was worshipped in temples that could be found all over Mesopotamia. According to the Bible, the cities of Beth-Dagon, Gaza, and Ashdod were home to some of the most important temples. He was worshipped by offering offerings and participating in feasts. His temple is destroyed, his image is laid prostrate before the ark of God, and with his hands and face cut off, demonstrating that he is powerless to resist the God of the Israelites, and his creature, which is a fish, complies with the will of God by swallowing and spitting out a prophet who is on his way to Dagon's people to tell them to repent and turn back to the true God. We need to be cautious about what we allow to infiltrate our lives. The Bible doesn't really mention if the Israelites engaged in Dagon worship. However, we know they dabbled with Dagon's gods, Baal and Asherah, so we can assume they threw a little Dagon in there. The seemingly innocuous can turn out to be insidious, so we must exercise extreme